Okay, this is the conclusion of the Klein book. It's the last two chapters, a chapter on social cultural implications of the Atlantic slave trade in America and the abolition of the slave trade. Last time, I did not realize that my notes were not up there, so this time we'll try and get the notes up. Let's see what we got. I believe that's it. Okay, so the slave trade, dealing with it sort of broadly. So the broad pattern of the slave trade is roughly 2/3 male and 1/3 female. And I should say the slave trade, I'm talking about the Atlantic slave trade, and the distinctions on that will be demonstrated in just a little bit. So the broad pattern is 2/3 male, 1/3 female, mostly adults. They generally did not purchase children. Sometimes when you look on the ship's logs, you will see children, and that's because they were forced to purchase them at some time or another. So in general, that's the broad pattern, but there are some useful and things to focus on when they change and why they change. So there are some changes late in the Atlantic slave trade. There are at times more women who are purchased on the coast of Africa and fed into the Atlantic slave trade system. The time where you see the most women purchased is right before slavery is abolished in certain places. So when it's going to be abolished by the British, it's announced that they're going to abolish it. British slave traders purchase more women for reasons that you can obviously think of. There are also times when slave purchasers would buy children. These are another sign that this is a distinction driven by the sellers. They would not be preferential choices because they take up roughly the same physical space and they're less likely to survive this horrific journey. So the merchants would prefer not to purchase children, but if that's what is for sale, especially when they're trying to fill up their boat, then that's what they're buying. So there is a little bit of change over time in terms of the makeup, as you can readily see. Why is this not giving me the option? There it is. Okay, so why so few women? It's not necessarily economic differences. Men and women worked in the field. If one could say there was anything that would be a positive of the slave trade, one could say that they were egalitarian in terms of work. There were not men's jobs or women's jobs. Everybody was conscripted to work in the field and coerced to work to their full potential. So if there are fewer women being fed into the Atlantic slave trade system, there must be another reason. And the other reason is that is a function of supply. African merchants were disinclined to send women to the Atlantic slave trade for a variety of reasons. One, in sub-Saharan Africa, the slave or the people acquiring slaves have other use for women. They increase the status. If you're a person of wealthy status, you own a few slaves, and generally you own female slaves because they're a sign of you can support more people. It's a sign, it's a type of conspicuous consumption, right? So it increases your status in society if you own slaves, especially more slaves that serve as concubines. In sub-Saharan Africa, agricultural work is women's work. So some people would acquire female slaves and put them to work producing more food. So in sub-Saharan Africa, that the task of raising food is one that generally women do. Also, when you think about the African continent, so the Atlantic slave trade is, for obvious purposes, on the Atlantic coast, although there are times that slave merchants would sail around the Horn of Africa and actually purchase slaves from the island of Madagascar or on the eastern coast of Africa. That's a function of supply and demand. The demand was such that they would seek out further places. It was not a function of choice. Purchasing slaves on the far coast Africa for the Atlantic slave trade was expensive and a much longer voyage, which means they would also more likely to lose slaves to death for time on the boat. But if that's where the supply is, that's where the supply is. So, but there's also a competing slave trade system, a much smaller volume, but one that is almost primarily female, and that's the Red Sea and Indian Ocean system, in which there was a high dollar paid for female slaves. So acquiring slaves, the men earned a higher price on the coast into the Atlantic slave trade system. The Indian Ocean Red Sea system, women paid a higher price. So that's where the trade was shifted. I always find it one of a number of tragedies that in the eastern section of Africa, you have men without wives, and then in the western section of Africa, you have wives without husbands, or women without husbands. So it's a function of the distortion set in place by this system of slavery. This distortion had impacted slave demographics. The populations are in Africa. There are 3 estimates on the demography of it. Some see a slight increase in the population of the regions that are met by impacted by the slave trade. Some see roughly a steady state in which the population stagnates, and some see a slight decline. So it's a matter of what percentage of the population is being stolen, and what percentage of the population is increasing because of the arrival of American food crops. And there's somewhat of a debate. But in terms of the slave demographics in the Atlantic slave trade system on the plantation side, this is generally a decline. Slave populations on the plantations decline steadily. Some places are worse. The Sugar Islands were by far the most deadly for slaves, but in general, anywhere in this system, the slave population declines, meaning that they need a constant input of new slaves in order to continue production. So that continual decline fueled the Atlantic slave trade, and as the sugar production or other production in these regions increased, so did the demand for slaves, fueling the increase of the Atlantic slave trade as well. That's true everywhere except the continental United States. And so that's the exception to the rule. And so that needs a little bit of discussion. This would also be a useful time for you to take a look on Blackboard. I have a link to the images of, it's a graph of the growth charts that would be helpful here. So in general, the population is always declining except in the US. Why is that the case? Well, if you listen to the owners of slaves who were writing about this stuff in the early 19th century, they will tell you it's because they treated the slaves so well. That is not true, and that's what that growth chart demonstrates. One of the arguments is that the owners treated their slaves so well that they had children, the children survived, and that's what the owners would tell you. And they would tell you relentlessly. But that's what the growth chart reveals, is that your bones don't lie. And what those figures show is that compared to white populations, compared to slaves on the island of Trinidad, slaves from the American South actually show retarded growth because of poor nutrition. They lag behind until about the age of 10 or 12. And the reason why 10 or 12 is important is that's when child slaves are moved into the field. And when they are moved into the field, then they begin to eat out of what's known as the common pot, and then they begin to get better nutrition and some protein. So better treatment is not the explanation. Was it because in the American South there was pressure to shorten the breastfeeding, which was seen as a practice that was out of step with what the Europeans were doing, that potentially could have a case. But it seems that the most likely reason is that this was a better health situation. The American South, there were places where malaria took hold. There was hard work. There was rough conditions to live in, but they were all better than living in the Sugar Islands and the South American colonies, because yellow fever was not established in the American South, because every time there was a frost, it killed the mosquitoes. So yellow fever was imported, but it did not stick. And for other reasons, moving into the interior of the continent produces fresh water. You leave your waste behind. So probably a better health situation in the American South accounts for the much greater survival. And for that reason, there was actual natural reproductive growth of the enslaved population in the South. So that has impacts in what becomes the continental United States, because slave culture is a syncretic mix. It's a mix of African traditions, traditions from what becomes the Americans, and also traditions from Europeans. They're all mixed together in one big borrowing. So for an example, you can think about voodoo. Voodoo is a mixture of African religious animist traditions that is combined with Catholicism. And so the mix of those two things produces what's known as voodoo, which is liberally borrowing from both. Places that have a stronger African component are also places where there's much more consistent and a much greater volume of import of African slaves to continually revitalize or reconnect it. And even when I say African, we're actually talking about a number of cultural traditions, because the slaves are gathered from a number of different regions of Africa. So it's not a monolith of African cultural traditions. It's a mixture, and this whole mixture is placed together, generating distinctive syncretic cultures. They tend to be more African, where the places where more African slaves are continually imported. So Brazil and the Sugar Islands tend to have more African components of this culture that develops. In other places, like the American South, where slavery, after a period of time, is the descendants of slaves rather than the continual import of Africans, results in a different cultural tradition. We can see a place where there is this sort of connection of continual African import that produces a different syncretic culture. The islands off of South Carolina were places where there was continued African slave importation for a longer period of time, and also after it was banned, probably unofficially. And so you have an interesting syncretic cultural tradition that forms. It's known as Gullah, develops its own distinctive language and distinctive cultural traditions with much greater, much more liberal borrowing from African cultural traditions. In this slave culture, there's, as is true for every cultural group, there's sort of a hierarchy. And it's interesting because the white population had its own vision of what this hierarchy is, which is different than what the people themselves, the slaves themselves, had. So for the white population, they thought positions of responsibility as dictated by whites would give greater cultural status. So the slaves who become overseers, they anticipated that they would be the leaders in the slave community, but that's not the case. What the community itself privileged was those with knowledge and skills, and those who had their own autonomy. Those were the ability to make your own decisions and to handle your own business, as it were something that were greatly valued in this enslaved population. So skilled versus unskilled, the unskilled laborers, someone who was a blacksmith or a carpenter or something, had a greater social status than the unskilled laborers. Another way to think about it is what is often referred to as the distinctions between house and field hands. Okay, so this business of the Atlantic slave trade is lucrative. It has a very complex business arrangement, and it had continued for an enormous amount of time. And so Klein asked the question, how does it end? Why does it end? Those are questions that from an economic sense don't make sense, as it were, because most economists think the business was still profitable. Not notably our friend Mr. Williams, who sees the Atlantic slave trade system as becoming economically unviable. But generally, economists think that it was still a profitable, and it was a still profitable business. I'll put a link up to it, or I'll post it on Blackboard. There's a link from the 1860 census in the American South, which shows who were the wealthiest people in this nation from the 1860 census, and far and away the wealthiest people were slave owners, large plantation owners in the American South. Slavery paid, and paid very well for those who ran the system. So if it's not extinguished because it becomes unprofitable and it's outcompeted by free trade or free labor, there must be another answer. And Klein says, I think in a hopeful fashion, he says, this is the first peaceful mass protest that eradicates a social evil, let's say. This is something that the populace drove out of business, not economics. So the first protest against this business of slavery comes in an intellectual format because it's part of the Enlightenment, right? And so you have to understand the underpinnings of this business of slavery, what makes it palatable for people to be slave owners so they can look themselves in the mirror, is that you have to denigrate the people who are enslaved. And so the first arguments are that blacks are, Africans are inherently inferior, right, for a variety of reasons. They're a lesser sort, is the sort of, I suppose, intellectual underpinnings of slavery. But that intellectual underpinning doesn't stand up to any sort of scrutiny. And in the Enlightenment period, the intellectual support for this notion of slavery is kicked out, right? So slave owners would argue that the slaves can't be educated, they can't be taught. But then, of course, when given the opportunity, people from Africa can learn to read and write, they can learn to compose music, they can learn to do just whatever, anything anybody else can do. So the intellectual argument that underpins slavery is kicked out, right? Now that's persuasive to, I suppose, intellectuals, but they tend to be a smaller portion of the population. What really led to the extinction of this business of slavery, or the eradication of the business of slavery, or what is formerly known as abolition, is the moral component. And here, probably the first set of folks who begin to address this from a moral point of view are the Quakers. The Quakers are a religious group or sect who believe that all are equal in the eyes of the Lord. And so taking that mandate seriously, they saw that slavery, enslaving other people, just doesn't fit with their tenets of their religion. And so there was pressure on Quakers, on other Quakers, to get out of the business because it's a morally unsound business. Also, Methodists, they were part of a radical evangelical movement who began to evangelize not just the white population, but they evangelized all populations. And in doing that, arguing that all are equal in the eyes of the Lord, then this becomes a moral peril to be a slave owner. And so they begin to apply pressure along this method. And abolitionists communicate across the Atlantic Ocean from Britain and in the United States. And it's in Britain where you first see this success of pushing this business, pushing the empire out of the business of slavery. And once the argument is persuaded in Britain, it was not just a moral argument or an economic argument in Britain. And as we'll see in our next book, there's an economic discussion of slavery, which brings in another component. But for Klein, this is largely driven by, the abolitionist movement is largely driven by moral authority. right? So when the British get out of the business, they don't just get out of the business, they decide they're going to force other folks to do this as well. So why did others go along? So for the United States, they had already banned the trade by 1808, right? It's written into the Constitution that slave trade, the Atlantic slave trade, would end. It's written in the Constitution as a way to solve one of the many impasses over the interest of the states in creating the Constitution. The Northerners went along with inculcating protection for slavery because they hoped by ending the Atlantic slave trade that it would lead to its abolition. The Southerners were not willing to sign a constitution that abolished slave trade at that moment because slavery was such a key component of their economy as well as their social and cultural relationships. But by pushing it off into the distance 25 years, that by 1808, the hope for the Northerners was that slavery would gradually abolish itself, and that the spur for that would be ending the importation of slaves. So for the United States, they're already out of the slave trade business by 1808. The French, resistant to the ideas that the British wanted to impose upon them, but after their defeat at Waterloo, it was made one of their terms of surrender. So the failure of Napoleon at Waterloo and the success of Nelson at Waterloo led to this idea that France is going to have to get out of the slave trade, and they did. For the Portuguese, under pressure from the British, they agreed to ban slavery, the Atlantic slave trade above the equator, which is really not much of a ban at all because most of their slave trade was below the equator, but at least they give the tacit idea that they're getting out of the business of slavery. It is for that reason, by the way, that Brazil was the last state in the Atlantic world to ban slavery. Slavery existed in Brazil until 1881. So for the Spanish were in dire straits. They needed money, and the British agreed to give them money to help stabilize their empire. A number of their colonial possessions in the New World were busily revolting. And so the Spanish had fallen on economic hard times. And in their desperate need for cash, the British used that as a lever to extract that they would get out of the slave trade. Right? So the British not only put diplomatic pressure on the other states to get out of the business of the slave trade, they put military pressure behind it as well. In 1819, the African Naval Squadron is created by the British Navy to seize ships engaged in the slave trade, and as we saw from those figures from our last lecture, they did seize quite a few. So much so, the pressure was so successful, by 1867, the last slave ship landed in Cuba. This is officially the end of the Atlantic slave trade, a system that had been running for centuries and had proven to be enormously lucrative for some people. So Klein also wants to talk about, so what other things went along with this end of the slave trade? And so it is pressure from the British, the first mass peaceful movement, as he calls it, but there are also some contributing reasons. So in Africa, one of the reasons is that Africans found more profitable uses of the population that they had formerly been fed into the slave trade. So in the early 19th century, about 90% of the export value that came to these Atlantic kingdoms and states came in the form of the export of slaves. By the mid-19th century, there was an increasing value in the global market for some of the products that could be grown in Africa, such as peanuts and palm oil, because Africa became more firmly tied into the world economy. Growing peanuts and palm on large monocrop plantations became valuable. So putting people to work on those plantations in Africa to produce a valuable product generated increasing rates of return, making reliance upon the selling people into the slave trade less a key component of it. So the African side began to find profitable uses. There's a marvelous book called the world, the world in a very small space in Africa. That's it. The world in a very small place in Africa. It's about a small region of Africa in which you can see how that small space, the Gambia, becomes part of this larger global world economic system. And merely by focusing on this relatively small spot in Africa, you could see how the global economic world changes, right? So that's on the African side. So what do plantations do? Sugar plantations still require massive inputs of labor. It's a murderous business in which people are paid poorly, but or not at all if you're slaves, but it returns a high profit. So they need this labor still to produce their product. So how do they solve their labor problems? In addition, we have the continuing labor problems in the United States. There's, for a long period of time, there was more land than labor. So in the American South, the reliance upon slave labor was the solution. But in other parts of the United States, there's still increasing labor demand. So in the United States, they solve their labor demands by importing Europeans. We call it immigration. And as we saw from our Crosby, demographic transition was leading to increasing quantities or numbers of people in European states. Those populations swelled, and the outlet for that increasing population came in the form of migration, which for the United States would be immigration. So more and more immigrants take over low-skilled jobs throughout the nation. On the sugar plantations, they find a variety of ways, all semi-coerced labor as opposed to the outright coerced labor that is the slave system. So you have a mix of African indentured servants, no longer slaves because the Atlantic slave trade has ended, but they're called indentured servants who are serving a similar type of role. You have Chinese coolies and Indian workers. These coolies and workers were hired by labor bosses who signed them to contracts that extended for multiple years, in which they would work to pay off a debt to the labor boss who had negotiated this rental, I suppose, of these folks to work on these plantations. Still an awful business, but not the formal chattel slavery that existed under the Atlantic slave trade. We see in between the years 1831 and 1890, 663,000 folks, African indentured servants, Chinese coolies, and Indian workers were shipped to these plantations to do fundamentally the same work that the African slaves have been doing before. So this conclusion of the African slave trade is driven by a number of different features in which the labor systems, the consumers of that labor have to adapt. Thus ends the Atlantic slave trade, and thus ends the book from Mr. Klein. So we'll stop here with the end of Klein's book, and then next we'll pick up with our next book, talking about the British Atlantic world.